A soft ambient silence settles in, broken only by the sound of a slow, distant clock ticking. In the heart of the 20th century's darkest conflict, a strange, silent battle unfolded. It was fought not with bullets, but against the primal need for sleep. What happens to the human soul when the promise of rest is repeatedly broken and exhaustion becomes a fatal vulnerability? Every soldier, on every side, reached a point where the natural limitations of the mind seemed impossible to overcome. They sought an impossible endurance, a way to keep going when the body demanded stillness. This is the hidden history of that breaking point, and the small white pill that offered a desperate, unnatural answer. We're not here to judge the choices made in the fog of war, but to trace the psychological journey of men who sought resilience beyond their human capacity. Over the next hour, let the quiet exploration of their desperate search for endurance guide your own mind toward a deep, untroubled rest. The siren song of sleep debt. Imagine a world where the simplest comfort, a deep, full night of sleep, becomes a luxury more valuable than gold. In the early 20th century, the massive scale of modern war introduced a new, relentless enemy: exhaustion. This wasn't just physical tiredness from marching. It was a profound, soul-deep weariness, a state where the mind could no longer hold on to attention or reason. This sleep debt was a silent killer, claiming victims through simple errors in judgment or a momentary failure to react. To seek survival was to seek to postpone the body's ultimate, non-negotiable demand for rest, creating a deep psychological strain that defined the modern soldier. This deep psychological craving for rest was rooted in our ancient history. For millennia, the cycles of light and dark, wakefulness and sleep governed human life. War, however, demanded the unnatural: continuous action, constant vigilance, and the suppression of biological necessity. The mind, desperate to slow down, begins to play tricks, showing ghostly figures in the darkness and muffling the sound of crucial orders. The fight to stay awake became an internal battle that rivaled the conflict happening outside the trenches and cockpits. It was the first sign that the human body was fundamentally incompatible with the demands of total war. The soldier's greatest hope became the promise of a quiet moment, a brief chance to close the eyes and let the world fade. But in the age of rapid movement and total deployment, this moment rarely came. Sleep deprivation became a weapon used against both the enemy and one's own men, pushing the boundary of what the human nervous system could withstand. When your thoughts become sticky and slow, and the world seems to tilt at odd angles, the quest for meaning in the fight itself is lost entirely to the simple, overwhelming need to just stop. This relentless denial of rest created a void, a space where true, deep connection to reality began to fray. The world turned into a blurred sequence of immediate threats and overwhelming demands. Soldiers needed a new form of endurance, a strength that didn't rely on the slow, unreliable process of natural recovery. They needed something immediate, something chemical, to trick the body into believing the dawn had come, even in the darkest hours. The search for a remedy to this profound human vulnerability would lead to a discovery that changed the course of the war and the shape of the world that followed. And so, the stage was set for the entrance of something revolutionary, a seemingly miraculous answer to the problem of human weakness. The desperate need to find an artificial meaning in the ceaseless fight against exhaustion became the driving force behind a new age of military chemistry. We now turn our attention to the logistical puzzle of modern combat, where the speed of tanks and planes suddenly exposed the slow human pace as the only remaining flaw in a machine of war. A war without rest, the new demand. The introduction of the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, changed everything. Before this, armies moved at the pace of a marching man or a horse. Now, with tanks, motorized columns, and aircraft working together, armies could cover hundreds of miles in days, not weeks. This new speed was a brilliant military advantage, but it created an agonizing pressure point. The soldiers driving and fighting could not keep up. The human being became the single, vulnerable bottleneck in this powerful machine. The problem wasn't the engine, it was the mind behind the wheel. Consider the tank commander awake for 48 hours trying to process maps, radio traffic and enemy positions while hurtling through the countryside. His brain was built for calm reflection, not for sustained hypervigilance under extreme stress. The faster the advance, the less time there was to stop, breathe, and rest. This constant forward motion created a terrifying psychological trap. To pause for a necessary 6 hours of sleep meant potentially losing a strategic advantage and allowing the enemy to regroup and counterattack. This created a severe ethical and mental conflict within the commanders. They needed their men to be alert, but they knew they were pushing them towards psychological breakdown. The speed of the war demanded unwavering clarity, but the human mind naturally degrades under such prolonged stress. The meaning of the war became tied to continuous performance, replacing human connection and moral reflection with the cold logic of mechanical efficiency. The old virtue of physical strength was replaced by the desperate requirement for mental durability. The solution had to be immediate and easily distributed, a way to cheat biology without sacrificing effectiveness. The leadership desperately searched for something that could offer a temporary artificial sense of meaning and purpose, the ability to execute one more order, drive one more kilometre, and stay awake for one more terrifying hour. They needed a chemical intervention to level the playing field between the speed of the machine and the limits of the man. It was in this moment of intense need that a new, revolutionary compound stepped onto the global stage. The need for a super-endurance pill became the unspoken prayer whispered through the fast-moving columns. This was the moment that pushed military science not toward bigger guns, but toward the inner workings of the human nervous system. The stage was now set for a small German pharmaceutical company to introduce a molecule that would fuel the first victories of the war and, in doing so, leave a dark and lasting mark on the psychology of endurance. The alchemist's promise. Pervitin is born. In the quiet, clinical atmosphere of a German pharmaceutical laboratory in the 1930s, a drug was born that would change the course of human endurance. Pervitin. It was nothing short of an alchemist's promise, a small white tablet that seemed to hold the power to conquer the ancient enemy of fatigue. Initially marketed to the general public as a treatment for depression and a simple energy booster, its true potential for military application was quickly realized by the medical minds of the Wehrmacht. It seemed too good to be true, a simple pill to banish sleep and elevate mood. The drug, a form of methamphetamine, worked by flooding the brain with crucial chemicals, giving the user a profound, almost euphoric sense of clarity and endless energy. Soldiers who had been awake for 2 days suddenly felt wide-eyed, sharp and focused, capable of performing complex tasks with unnatural ease. This was the chemical realization of the German military's goal, to create a soldier whose endurance matched the speed of his machine. The psychological effect was immediate and intoxicating. It replaced fear and exhaustion with a temporary exhilarating sense of power and control. For men facing the terrifying reality of war, Pervitin offered a form of false meaning, the ability to be a perfect, tireless cog in a massive engine. They didn't feel they were just surviving, they felt they were operating at their absolute peak, achieving a level of performance that was otherwise unreachable. This high dissolved doubt and replaced it with a quiet, persistent confidence, making the soldier feel completely sufficient for the task at hand. The pill became a psychological shield against the overwhelming demands of the battlefield. The military moved fast. Pervitin was rapidly mass-produced and distributed under the name Panzer Schokolade, or Tank Chocolate, and Stücke Tabletten for the dive bomber pilots. It wasn't treated as a powerful narcotic. It was viewed as necessary equipment, as vital as gasoline or ammunition. The moral and physical consequences of long-term dependence were pushed aside in the rush for immediate tactical advantage. The ultimate psychological goal was victory, and if a pill could bring that closer, any risk was deemed acceptable. This small pill fundamentally altered the psychological compact between a soldier and his duty. Instead of relying on discipline and rest, the soldiers were now relying on chemistry to find their strength. The very nature of resilience changed overnight. The pill offered an easy substitute for the hard-won clarity of genuine rest, setting the stage for the drug-fueled speed that defined the opening moves of the war. The Blitzkrieg battery, pill for the Panzer. Our tank driver, Günther, had been at the controls for 50 hours straight, the roar of the engine and the smell of diesel becoming his new reality. By the third dawn his thoughts were slurry, his movements were slow, and the fear was setting in, not of the enemy, but of his own debilitating tiredness. Then came the small white packet of Pervitin. He swallowed it with a swig of water and waited. What followed was a sudden, clean, unnatural sweep of energy. The exhaustion didn't vanish. It was simply pushed to the back of a very fast line. Suddenly the maps in the cramped tank turret were sharp. The radio crackle made sense, and the world outside the viewport was vividly clear. This was the psychological high of Pervitin in action, a feeling of perfect, effortless competence. The sheer, relentless pace of the Blitzkrieg, the strategic goal, now felt entirely manageable, even exhilarating on a personal level. Günther didn't feel tired. He felt necessary, driven by a clean, burning fuel that made him believe he was truly invincible. This temporary mastery over his own biology was his chemical meaning. This feeling of unstoppable momentum was crucial to the initial success of the invasion of France in 1940. The German columns pushed deep into enemy territory without pausing for rest, exploiting the speed advantage that their chemically fueled crews could sustain. French and British forces, operating on a traditional schedule of rest, were simply outmaneuvered and outpaced. It was a victory of relentless speed and psychological endurance, purchased at the cost of the soldiers' future mental health. The drug had succeeded in turning men into components of the machine, but the high was a cruel illusion. The constant, unnatural clarity was bought on credit, and the body never forgets a debt. Even in the exhilarating rush of the advance, a quiet, chilling realization began to settle in. The body was no longer dictating its own needs. The soldier was now entirely dependent on the pill to simply maintain baseline function. The meaning of their service was now tied to a chemical dependency, a profound inner conflict that would resurface in the quieter, darker moments. For now, the victory seemed to justify the means. The French campaign was a terrifying demonstration of what a drug could achieve when paired with a military strategy of speed. It set a precedent for the rest of the war. Human limits were optional. The men had tasted the power of endless wakefulness, and the shadow of that addiction would now follow the army into every subsequent campaign. The psychological crash, the debt comes. Due the high was always finite. For every hour of unnatural wakefulness Pervitin granted, the body silently levied a punishing interest rate. The psychological crash that followed the initial rush was a descent into a grey, debilitating reality, far worse than the original exhaustion. The energy didn't simply dissipate. It was yanked away, replaced by a profound anhedonia, a deep inability to find pleasure or meaning in anything. The tank driver, Günther, who felt invincible yesterday, now struggled to find the motivation to lift his own helmet. This crashing phase was where the true psychological cost of the drug was revealed. It wasn't just physical fatigue, it was the mind's slow, sticky inability to process emotional clarity. Confusion set in, paranoia began to creep around the edges of reality, and the temporary confidence evaporated into a nagging sense of inadequacy. The soldier realized he had borrowed strength from a source that demanded his very self in return. The feeling of being a perfect machine was replaced by the terrifying realization of being a broken, dependent animal. The only immediate escape from this psychological abyss was the same source that created it: another pill. This established the insidious cycle of dependency. What began as a strategic tool to cheat exhaustion quickly morphed into a necessary crutch to simply feel normal again. The meaning of their military service shifted from being about duty to being about maintenance, the maintenance of an artificial state, just to keep pace with the war machine they served. This was a battle fought deep inside the mind, far from the physical front lines. The commanders, witnessing this cycle of unnatural peak and profound trough, faced a terrifying dilemma. The short-term tactical advantages of Pervitin were undeniable. It allowed for impossible feats of endurance that won battles. But the long-term cost in morale and mental stability was catastrophic. The psychological historian must note this trade-off. A momentary victory over the enemy was bought at the expense of the soldiers' future peace, creating a dependence that extended the war into their souls long after the armistice. The drug, therefore, created a perverse sense of meaning for the addicted soldier. Their entire reality became centered on acquiring and consuming the next dose. It became the quiet, internal narrative of the war, overshadowing the nationalistic slogans and grand strategies. As the war dragged on, the reliance on this chemical high intensified, setting the stage for the ultimate test of endurance: the frozen, brutal landscape of the Eastern Front, where survival demanded more than just speed. It demanded chemical persistence against the cold itself. The Eastern Front grind, cold and chemical endurance, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in 1941 transformed the psychological dynamic of the war. No longer was it a swift blitzkrieg. It became a punishing, protracted grind against immense distances and the brutal, paralyzing cold. Pervitin, which had once been a tool for speed, now became a grim instrument of sheer survival. The soldiers battling the Russian winter weren't looking for a high, they were looking for a chemical shield against freezing, lethargy, and the soul-crushing despair of continuous retreat. The German supply lines fractured, and the promise of rest and warmth vanished. In the trenches and foxholes, the fight was less against the Soviet soldier and more against the environment. Exhaustion, cold, and malnutrition combined into a lethal triple threat. Pervitin offered a temporary, desperately sought warmth, boosting circulation and creating the illusion of inner fire. This artificial heat became a form of meaning, a tiny, flickering point of control in an environment of absolute chaos. But the vast, frozen landscape amplified the drug's negative effects. The lack of sleep in sub-zero temperatures led to rapid, aggressive psychological degradation. Hallucinations, paranoia about the vast silent forests and violent mood swings became commonplace. The soldiers were chemically awake, but psychologically fractured, making terrible, costly decisions on the battlefield. The pill that promised resilience now exposed a profound vulnerability, highlighting the fact that no drug can truly defeat the laws of nature. The psychological meaning of the drug shifted again, from being a tool for the conqueror to a necessary sedative for the suffering. It became a way to dull the feeling of extreme physical pain and to mute the despair of a war that seemed endless and unwinnable. It was the last desperate act of defiance against the overwhelming reality of the environment. The act of swallowing the pill was a final internal promise that they would somehow endure one more night. The Eastern Front was the theatre where the Wehrmacht's reliance on Pervitin reached its darkest, most tragic peak. Hundreds of millions of tablets were consumed, fueling not a swift victory, but a prolonged, agonizing struggle. The human cost was now measured not just in casualties, but in the shattered psychological state of the survivors, who would carry the dual trauma of war and chemical dependency long after the snows melted. The pilot's edge, the illusion of control in the air. In the tight, high-stakes world of aerial combat, the psychological demand was different. It required not just endurance, but absolute precision under lethal stress. For the Luftwaffe pilots, flying missions that lasted hours through hostile skies, Pervitin offered an intoxicating illusion of perfect hyper-focused control. A bomber pilot, his mind dulled by hours of engine noise and cold, could take a dose and suddenly feel his connection to the aircraft sharpen, his reflexes quicken, and his world narrow down to the necessary coordinates. This was the pilot's chemical high, a moment of pristine clarity where doubt vanished, replaced by an exhilarating sense of mastery over the machine and the mission. They felt they were operating at the zenith of human capability, transcending the limits of the biological brain. The psychological meaning here was found in the certainty it offered, the certainty that this time they would not miss the target, they would not misread the instruments, they would not succumb to the enemy lurking in the clouds. However, the consequences of the crash were deadly in the thin, unforgiving air. The overconfidence fueled by the amphetamine led to increased risk-taking, followed by crippling spatial disorientation when the drug wore off. The pilot, once sharp and decisive, would descend into a thick fog of confusion and delayed reaction, often with fatal results during landing or high-stress maneuvers. The drug didn't eliminate exhaustion. It merely masked it, ensuring that when the fatigue finally hit, it did so without warning. The use of Stuka-Tabletten and similar preparations among pilots created a complex ethical void within the air forces. Commanders knew they were trading long-term reliability for short-term tactical advantage. The pilots themselves understood the danger, yet the competitive and desperate nature of the job made the chemical edge irresistible. In this scenario, the pill became an enabler of a dangerous form of hubris, convincing the user that they could defy the fundamental laws of physiology and gravity. Ultimately, the chemical focus provided only a temporary artificial respite from the relentless pressure of being a solitary target high above the earth. It provided a false sense of meaning in an environment defined by chaos and chance. As the Luftwaffe's supremacy faded and their attrition rates soared, the psychological cost of relying on this unsustainable clarity became tragically clear, foreshadowing the deeper ethical crisis that underpinned the drug's distribution. The doctor's dilemma, the ethical void. The widespread distribution of Pervitin did not occur without internal conflict, particularly within the Wehrmacht's medical corps. Army doctors were trained healers, yet they found themselves in the impossible position of being required to administer a potent, addiction-forming substance to young, otherwise healthy men. This created a profound ethical void at the heart of military medicine. The psychological meaning of their profession, to preserve health, was completely inverted to fulfill a strategic goal, to enable maximum destruction. The dilemma was rationalized through the cold logic of necessity. The doctors argued and were often genuinely convinced that the drug was not a choice, but a tool for prevention. They viewed it as a necessary defense against the far greater threat of battlefield fatigue, which they argued would lead to catastrophic errors, panic, and mass casualty. The pill was framed not as a dependency, but as a temporary critical piece of protective equipment designed to ensure the men maintained their focus when it mattered most. Yet, this internal justification could not fully silence the anxiety over the soldiers' inevitable crash and dependency. Documents from the period reveal muted concerns about the drug's long-term effects on the nervous system, but these were consistently overruled by operational command's demands for continuous performance. The individual soldier's psychological well-being was sacrificed on the altar of tactical advantage, a grim choice that defined the moral flexibility required by total war. This put the medical personnel in a position of quiet complicity. Every time they handed out a strip of Panzerschocker aid, they were participating in the slow chemical breakdown of the fighting force. The doctors became agents of the machine, responsible for maximizing the speed and endurance of the war effort, rather than prioritizing the individual patient. Their purpose was tragically redefined by the context of the war itself. This chapter, in the history of military medicine, serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly ethical boundaries can dissolve under extreme pressure. The doctors, striving to find meaning in their service, had to reconcile their professional oaths with the brutal mandate of the state. The quiet, tragic weight of this compromise would linger long after the war, raising deep questions about the role of medicine when the goal is not healing, but chemically enhanced endurance. From fuel to crutch, civilian dependence and aftermath. The story of Pervitin did not begin or end on the battlefield. It started with a quiet debut in German pharmacies. Initially sold over the counter, the drug was marketed to civilians as a revolutionary way to combat the minor depressions and lethargy of modern life. It was a chemical promise of efficiency, a way for clerks, night shift factory workers, and even housewives to find the energy to meet the increasing demands of a rapidly modernizing society. This civilian use foreshadowed the military's eventual reliance. The drug offered a sense of effortless competence to citizens struggling with the pre-war anxieties and the pressure to contribute to the nation's rising industrial capacity. The meaning found here was one of perfect utility, the ability to always be alert, always productive, always ready. It was an early taste of a chemically optimized self, long before the chaos of the war demanded it. As the war intensified, and Pervitin was funneled almost exclusively to the troops, the psychological demand in the civilian population didn't vanish. It merely changed form. When soldiers returned home, even temporarily, the drug sometimes came with them, creating a shadow market and introducing dependency back into the heart of German society. This illicit use began to expose the dark, destructive potential that military necessity had, hidden for so long. The post-war period was the final tragic act of Pervitin's reign. As soldiers were demobilized, many found they could not simply set aside the chemical crutch that had enabled their survival for years. They returned with profound dependencies, psychological wounds, and a nervous system accustomed to unnatural stimulation. The pill that provided artificial meaning in war became a devastating obstacle to finding true meaning and stability in peace. This final transition from strategic fuel to personal destructive crutch defines the ultimate psychological lesson of Pervitin. It showed a society that had briefly accepted the premise that human limits were optional, only to discover that the debt exacted by such a belief was impossibly high. The lingering shadow of that wartime dependency marked the transition into a post-war world where chemical solutions to human struggle would become a quiet, persistent and tragic fixture. Let us pause for a moment on this quiet, vast canvas of wartime Europe. We have witnessed the initial, intoxicating high of the Blitzkrieg, the terrifying speed purchased by a small white pill that promised to transcend human nature. The desperation of the German soldier to find meaning in his unnatural endurance pushed him into a chemical dependency that defined his service. Now, we pull back to see the wider theatre, spanning from the cold forests of the East to the scorching deserts of North Africa. The psychological stakes of this conflict were not confined to one side. The constant threat of total loss, the unrelenting noise, and the sheer scale of death placed an unsustainable burden on every single mind involved. This wasn't merely a contest of machines and numbers, it was a desperate race for mental durability, a competition to see which side could last just 1 hour longer than the other. Sleep, or the lack thereof, became the most critical, unacknowledged variable. The need for a chemical edge was a universal human response to the inhumanity of total war. The initial advantage held by the Wehrmacht was alarming, forcing the Allies to acknowledge the new reality. They could not afford to be defeated by sheer exhaustion. The strategic failure of the French and British forces to counter the relentless German pace highlighted the fact that human biology, not technology, was the limiting factor. The commanders of the Allied forces, British, American, and Commonwealth, observed this phenomenon with a mixture of horror and grim pragmatism. They saw the psychological wreckage left in the wake of the German advance, but they also understood the compelling strategic necessity of endurance. To simply ignore the chemical advantage would be to concede the war to the enemy's pharmacological innovations. This led to a shift in their own medical and logistical thinking. The Allies would not only develop their own equivalent to Pervitin, but they would rationalise its use as a matter of simple necessity, a quiet piece of standard issue equipment. The moral questions were set aside in favour of the immediate goal, survival and victory. As we transition into the second half of our journey, we will explore the Allied side of this chemical coin. We move now from the intoxicating rush of the conqueror to the grim, grinding reality of the defender and the eventual liberator, driven by their own small white pills. We have crossed the threshold of war's initial fury, seeing how the human mind was pushed to its absolute limits, finding a temporary chemical form of resilience. This search for meaning, the meaning found in simply enduring another day, is the thread connecting all of history's quiet souls. If these tales of profound human experience, delivered with a calming, reflective tone, have helped settle your thoughts and prepare your mind for rest, please consider joining our growing community. Subscribing to The Psychological Historian ensures that these immersive journeys into the quiet struggles of the past continue to arrive, guiding your nights to deeper, more restorative peace. Take a moment to rest, and when you are ready, we will continue our journey through the second half of this chemically altered conflict. Benzedrine, the American answer. The Allied response to the chemical edge began not with tanks in Europe, but under the blazing sun of North Africa. Here the challenge was less about cold and more about heat endurance and the vast, soul-crushing distances of the desert. The British desert rats needed to keep pace with Rommel's forces, pushing their vehicles and their bodies far beyond the limits of natural endurance. Benzedrine, the Allied amphetamine equivalent, became their necessary fuel, a small measure of control against the overwhelming indifferent heat. It was a choice between chemical reliance and collapsing into the sand. For the soldiers driving supply trucks or maintaining tank vigilance under a scorching sun, the pill was a lifeline. It muted the sensory overload of the heat, suppressed hunger and thirst, and provided the mental sharpness needed to navigate the featureless terrain. The psychological meaning here was simple: utility. The drug made the impossible grind possible, transforming the desperate necessity of survival into a feeling of grim, sustained competence. The men didn't seek a high, they sought only the ability to function when their biology screamed for rest. The distribution in the British Commonwealth forces was slightly more measured than the initial German enthusiasm, focusing on critical roles like pilots, armoured crews, and specialised long-range patrol groups. Yet, the effect was the same: a temporary, non-negotiable postponement of sleep debt. These long, chemically fuelled days allowed for the decisive flanking manoeuvres that characterised the Desert War, movements that would have been impossible if the drivers had been forced to stop and rest according to human limits. But the desert, like the Eastern Front, offered no hiding place for the crash. The intense heat combined with amphetamine use led to severe dehydration and profound swings in mood and clarity. A soldier who felt capable of anything at dawn could be overwhelmed by sudden, paralysing fatigue by nightfall. The commanders, though achieving tactical victories, understood they were operating on the razor's edge of human capability, constantly monitoring their men for the subtle signs of chemical overdose or psychological burnout. The Desert Campaign thus became a crucible for the Allied forces, solidifying Benzedrine not as an optional tool, but as a silent, essential partner in the fight. The psychological contract was simple. We will ask you to do the unnatural, and this pill is the only thing that can bridge the gap between human capacity and military necessity. It set the precedent for the massive later use of amphetamines across every front where the Allies fought. The RAF's vigil, guardians of the night. The Royal Air Force's bomber crews faced perhaps the longest, most psychologically demanding missions of the early war. 8 to 10 hours flying over hostile territory at night. In the cramped, cold and vibrating darkness of the aircraft, the insidious creeping of exhaustion was a death sentence. To combat this, Benzedrine became standard issue, transforming the meaning of the night vigil from a struggle against fatigue into a sustained, chemically enabled defense of the skies. For the navigator, hunched over his charts as his mind grew foggy, the pill provided a necessary return to razor-sharp focus. For the pilot, wrestling with the heavy controls and the constant threat of attack, it ensured his response time remained flawless, even in the hour before dawn when the body naturally shuts down. The psychological meaning derived from the drug was one of reliability. The pill guaranteed that the human element would not fail the complex machine. The use was systematic. Crews were briefed on when to take the dose to maximize alertness during the most critical phases of the mission: the navigation run over the target and the dangerous return flight. The chemical boost allowed the pilot to maintain an aggressive, defensive posture against night fighters that his natural state would have rendered impossible. It was a choice between chemical reliance and the certainty of falling asleep at the controls. However, the consequences of the crash were severe. Post-mission, the crews were often rendered psychologically inert, unable to process the trauma they had just endured or even communicate coherently. The constant cycle of chemically induced hypervigilance, followed by profound exhaustion, put an enormous strain on their long-term mental health. The pill allowed them to win the battle, but it ensured the war would continue to rage within their minds long after they landed. This aerial reliance underscores the profound shift in the psychology of war. The body could no longer be trusted to perform when the mission demanded continuous, flawless effort. The RAF's reliance on the drug was a grim acknowledgement that the modern conflict had rendered natural human endurance obsolete, making chemical aid an essential tragic component of their silent nightly sacrifice. The Desert Rat's dose: speed in North Africa. The Allied response to the chemical edge began not with tanks in Europe, but under the blazing sun of North Africa. Here, the challenge was less about cold and more about heat endurance and the vast, soul-crushing distances of the desert. The British Desert Rats needed to keep pace with Rommel's forces, pushing their vehicles and their bodies far beyond the limits of natural endurance. Benzedrine, the Allied amphetamine equivalent, became their necessary fuel, a small measure of control against the overwhelming, indifferent heat. It was a choice between chemical reliance and collapsing into the sand. For the soldiers driving supply trucks or maintaining tank vigilance under a scorching sun, the pill was a lifeline. It muted the sensory overload of the heat, suppressed hunger and thirst, and provided the mental sharpness needed to navigate the featureless terrain. The psychological meaning here was simple: utility. The drug made the impossible grind possible, transforming the desperate necessity of survival into a feeling of grim, sustained competence. The men didn't seek a high. They sought only the ability to function when their biology screamed for rest. The distribution in the British Commonwealth forces was slightly more measured than the initial German enthusiasm, focusing on critical roles like pilots, armoured crews, and specialised long-range patrol groups. Yet the effect was the same: a temporary, non-negotiable postponement of sleep debt. These long, chemically fueled days allowed for the decisive flanking manoeuvres that characterised the Desert War, movements that would have been impossible if the drivers had been forced to stop and rest according to human limits. But the desert, like the Eastern Front, offered no hiding place for the crash. The intense heat combined with amphetamine use led to severe dehydration and profound swings in mood and clarity. A soldier who felt capable of anything at dawn could be overwhelmed by sudden, paralysing fatigue by nightfall. The commanders, though achieving tactical victories, understood they were operating on the razor's edge of human capability, constantly monitoring their men for the subtle signs of chemical overdose or psychological burnout. The Desert Campaign thus became a crucible for the Allied forces, solidifying Benzedrine not as an optional tool but as a silent, essential partner in the fight. The psychological contract was simple. We will ask you to do the unnatural, and this pill is the only thing that can bridge the gap between human capacity and military necessity. It set the precedent for the massive later use of amphetamines across every front where the Allies fought. The American advance, GIs, and the Go pill. The American entry into the chemical theatre of war formalized the drug's transition from a novel experiment to a standard logistical requirement. Dubbed the Go pill by GIs, Benzedrine became an indispensable part of the massive, relentless drive across Europe following the Normandy landings. This wasn't the lightning speed of the Blitzkrieg, but a grinding, sustained advance that demanded men be awake and functioning for days at a time, keeping pace with the colossal supply chains. For the American infantry, the pill provided a psychological shield against the numbing routine of sustained combat and the heavy weight of equipment. It allowed them to move, dig, and stay alert during grueling overnight watches when the natural ebb of energy would have rendered them vulnerable. The meaning found in the Go pill was one of shared necessity. Every man knew he was pushing beyond his limits, and the pill became a quiet form of camaraderie, a silent acknowledgement that they were all suffering the same relentless demand. The most critical users, however, were the long-haul truck drivers of the Red Ball Express. These men were the lifeblood of the Allied advance, pushing supplies from the landing beaches to the rapidly moving front lines. Their schedules were impossible, sometimes requiring them to drive for 72 hours with only short, dangerous naps. Benzedrine allowed them to maintain the speed of the advance, ensuring that fuel, ammunition, and food reached the fighting troops, thus turning the tide of the war with sheer, chemically induced logistical effort. The American Medical Corps treated Benzedrine with a clinical rational detachment. It was issued not as a recreational substance, but as a strictly controlled tool for mitigating performance drop-off under extreme conditions. The internal rationalization was strong. In a war of attrition and rapid movement, the temporary chemical boost was seen as a necessary evil to save lives and ensure the mission's success. The psychological cost was acknowledged in reports, but the overriding imperative of victory always took precedence. By the end of the war, American forces had consumed hundreds of millions of amphetamine doses. The Go pill had successfully leveled the pharmacological playing field initiated by the Germans. It underscored a grim truth about modern warfare. The conflict was now fought not just between armies, but between the chemical ability of opposing sides to defy human biology. The war had been won, in part, by the sustained unnatural vigilance of its troops, the hidden cost, dependence and paranoia. Beneath the tactical successes of Allied amphetamine use lay a profound and silent psychological crisis. While the drugs kept men awake, they did not eliminate the underlying need for sleep, they simply suppressed the warning signals. This led to a range of severe consequences beyond the typical crash, introducing long-term dependence and paranoia that shattered the inner peace of countless soldiers. The very tool meant to ensure resilience began to undermine their psychological reality. The sustained lack of restorative sleep, combined with chemical stimulation, pushed many men into amphetamine psychosis. They experienced vivid hallucinations, intense delusions of persecution, and profound, baseless distrust of their comrades. In the high-stress environment of combat, this paranoia was indistinguishable from genuine threat, leading to tragic errors in judgment and moments of devastating isolation. The pill that promised clarity ultimately delivered a terrifying form of chemical madness. This side effect struck at the very core of military cohesion. Trust, the essential psychological bond that holds a unit together, dissolved when the medic who handed out the Go pill was also handing out a drug that made the user suspect his best friend was an enemy collaborator. The meaning the soldier had sought in shared endurance was replaced by a terrifying sense of solitary alienation. where their own mind became the most unpredictable battlefield. The high tolerance and addiction that followed the war were direct results of this pervasive sanctioned use. Soldiers who had been prescribed the pills for years found their natural body chemistry irrevocably altered. The meaning of their daily lives became centered on the drug, not to achieve a high, but simply to stave off the crushing depression and inability to function that characterized withdrawal. Their physical survival had been ensured by a drug, but their mental health was the collateral damage. The Allied forces, unlike the Germans, maintained stricter controls, but the scale of distribution meant the chemical scars were widespread. This chapter of history is a quiet tragedy, highlighting that the war didn't just end when the shooting stopped. For hundreds of thousands of veterans, the real, internal fight, the one against chemical dependency and the resulting psychological damage, was just beginning, a testament to the devastating trade-off between military necessity and human health. Kamikaze's choice, the ultimate chemical sacrifice. In the Pacific Theatre, the psychological use of amphetamines reached its most desperate and extreme conclusion. Japanese forces, facing overwhelming Allied industrial power, rationalized the use of drugs like Philipon, a Japanese form of methamphetamine, not just for endurance but to enable the ultimate act of commitment, the kamikaze mission. For these young pilots, the drug was the final, chemical step in dissolving the self, making the act of self-sacrifice feel inevitable, euphoric, and right. The psychological meaning of the drug here was inextricably linked to national duty and ceremonial suicide. Philipon was used to suppress any rational fear, doubt, or second-guessing in the final hours. The drug provided a terrifying manic euphoria, transforming the grim reality of a death sentence into an exhilarating sacred quest. The high was deliberately synchronized with the ultimate sacrifice, ensuring the pilot felt perfectly clear, focused, and utterly resolute in the final, non-negotiable moments of his life. The Japanese military's rationale was driven by desperation. They needed their pilots to perform complex navigation and control in a state of extreme fatigue, culminating in a precise destructive impact. The chemical boost guaranteed this final focus, but more critically, it provided a psychological narrative. The drug enabled the transcendence of the self, allowing the pilot to escape the terror of his fate by entering a state of absolute chemically induced meaning. This was a tragic perversion of human psychology. Instead of using the drug to preserve life through endurance, it was used to ensure death through reckless focus. The act of taking the pill became a final ritual, a confirmation of the ultimate commitment to the emperor and the nation. The physical high was inseparable from the spiritual meaning of the mission, creating a terrifying synthesis of chemical and cultural imperative. The psychological legacy of this extreme use is one of the war's darkest episodes. It showed how far a military command would go to manipulate the human mind under pressure, using chemistry to erase the most basic survival instinct. It is a powerful, melancholic reminder that the search for meaning, when coupled with absolute desperation and chemical influence, can lead to the most profound and irrevocable acts of self-destruction. The silent scars, post-war addiction crisis. When the guns finally fell silent, the war's chemical ghost emerged from the shadows. Soldiers across all nations, German, American, British and Japanese, returned home carrying a silent scar, a deep, entrenched dependence on the amphetamines that had enabled their survival. The logistical advantage of the pill during the war became a devastating addiction crisis in the peace that followed, a profound challenge that post-war societies were tragically unprepared to face. For the veterans, the return to peace was often characterized by a profound lack of energy and an inability to cope with the mundane without their go pill or Pervitin. The pills had provided a clear artificial meaning, the ability to function and survive, which was suddenly gone. They struggled to find the motivation for civilian tasks, feeling slow and inadequate compared to their chemically enhanced selves of the past. The withdrawal was not just physical agony, it was a psychological crisis of identity. The post-war medical infrastructure failed them. Doctors, who had often been the ones to distribute the drugs, lacked the knowledge and resources to treat the resulting addiction and psychosis. The psychological wounds were often misdiagnosed as simple nerves or shell shock, ignoring the core chemical dependency. The veterans, isolated in their struggle, felt betrayed by the very system that had demanded this unnatural endurance from them. In Japan, the crisis was particularly acute, as immense stocks of Philipon were dumped onto the black market, fueling a massive wave of civilian addiction that lasted decades. The high that had once been linked to ultimate sacrifice was now linked to urban decay and social disorder. This painful aftermath revealed that the chemical meaning found during the war was purely contextual. Divorced from the battlefield, the drug offered only emptiness and despair. This period serves as a crucial psychological bridge, showing that the meaning found through chemical means is unsustainable. The true challenge of peace was not just rebuilding cities, but rebuilding the shattered nervous systems of men who had been chemically forced to deny their human limits. The legacy of the Go pill was a profound lesson in the debt owed to the body and the mind when their natural needs are violently ignored for strategic gain. The chemical legacy: modern military use. The end of World War II did not mark the end of the chemical war against sleep. It only formalized its acceptance as a tool of modern military strategy. The use of amphetamines continued through the Korean War, where extreme cold and long periods of vigilance demanded superhuman endurance, and later, extensively in the Vietnam War, particularly among helicopter and fixed-wing pilots flying sustained, dangerous missions. The lesson learned was that chemical support was a strategic necessity, not an optional convenience. The core psychological struggle remained the same: how to match human reaction time with the relentless speed of modern conflict. The drug's meaning evolved from a desperation crutch to a tool of calculated peak performance. In modern air forces, strict protocols were established to manage the use of Go pills, often Benzedrine, to ensure pilots could maintain razor-sharp focus during complex multi-hour sorties. The goal was no longer the manic, reckless high of Pervitin, but controlled, sustained, professional vigilance. The debate, however, never truly disappeared. While controlled use undoubtedly saved lives by preventing fatigue-related accidents and errors, it continued to raise fundamental questions about ethical limits. Is a chemically enabled soldier truly making a free choice, or is their performance dictated by their dependency? The psychological focus here shifted from simply surviving the battle to surviving the drug itself, forcing commands to implement stringent post-mission screening and recovery protocols. The reliance on these pharmaceuticals underscores a persistent philosophical paradox in military readiness. The more technologically advanced the war becomes, the more essential the human mind's immediate, flawless response. Since natural rest cannot be reliably guaranteed in a crisis, the chemical shortcut remains an option. The meaning of endurance has become permanently tied to the lab, not just the spirit. Today, the use is highly regulated and focused on specific missions where sleep deprivation poses an unacceptable risk. Yet, the chemical legacy of WWII is clear. The war against sleep is ongoing. It is a quiet acknowledgement that, when pushed to the absolute edge, military leaders will always prioritize the tactical advantage of wakefulness over the natural limits of the human condition. Beyond the battle, the search for natural resilience. The final essential psychological lesson of the drug-fueled war transcends the battlefield. The ultimate power of resilience does not lie in a pill, but in the acceptance of human limits. For the veterans who successfully navigated the post-war crisis, the road to recovery was the painful realization that the manufactured meaning of the amphetamine high was an obstacle to finding true, lasting peace. They had to learn, often through immense struggle, how to find endurance naturally. This journey back was about surrender, the surrender to the body's natural cycle, the surrender of the illusion of invincibility. They had to redefine their personal meaning, moving it away from relentless performance and towards quiet, stable presence. The long, difficult process of detoxification and psychological adjustment was the final, hardest battle, proving that the integrity of the mind cannot be indefinitely suspended for the sake of an external mission. The psychological historian notes that the true end of the war for these individuals came only when they embraced vulnerability. They had to accept that slowness, tiredness, and doubt were not failures, but necessary human signals. The meaning they sought in hypervigilance was finally found in the deep, quiet clarity of genuine rest, a peace that was honestly earned, not chemically bought. This ultimate shift from chemical dependence to psychological acceptance is the thread that brings us back to the present moment. The soldiers, in their darkest moments of exhaustion, were fighting against the very biological demands that keep us grounded and sane. They pushed against nature's boundaries, only to discover that the most profound strength lies in honouring them. As we conclude this exploration of chemical endurance, we leave behind the desperation of the battlefield and the artificial urgency of the high. We turn our attention now to the peaceful, quiet recovery, the final, gentle moments where the need for rest is no longer a strategic failure, but a profound, necessary victory of the self. This is where their search for meaning finally aligns with your own search for peace. The last pill, the return to peace. The true end of the war for many veterans was not the armistice, but the moment they chose to put down the last pill. Demobilization, though celebrated, was a psychologically agonizing process. They were being asked to shed the identity of the chemically driven warrior and relearn the slow, gentle pace of civilian life. This return demanded a complete reordering of their internal world, finding a way to exist without the constant manic clarity the drug had provided. Imagine the simple, profound difficulty of sitting still. The veterans' nervous systems were tuned to the high-frequency demands of combat. Quietness felt like a threat, and lethargy a moral failure. They carried the deep psychological weight of knowing that their most resilient moments, the long drives, the sustained vigils, were chemically engineered. The quiet decision to forgo the daily dose was an act of profound courage, a choice to face the true, unvarnished self hidden beneath the artificial stimulation. The process of withdrawal was a descent into a psychological landscape of crippling depression, exhaustion, and anxiety. Yet it was a necessary journey, an expiation of the debt incurred during the war. It was here, in the depths of post-chemical exhaustion, that a new, authentic form of meaning began to take root. The meaning found in simple presence, in the slow, natural rhythm of life, rather than the relentless momentum of war. The soldier who once felt invincible on the go pill had to learn to accept his vulnerability. He had to accept that slowness was not failure, and rest was not weakness. The final, powerful image is not of a hero achieving an impossible feat, but of a tired man finally home, choosing to leave the small white crutch on a nightstand. This quiet act was his final, most significant victory of the entire conflict. By relinquishing the last pill, these men finally surrendered to their own humanity. They replaced the fleeting, false certainty of the chemical high with the deep, slow-burning resilience that comes from accepting the natural laws of the body. Their final, silent testimony confirms that while a drug can help win a battle, only true rest can win back the self. Finding rest, a universal human need. The journey of the war soldier, obsessed with endurance, finally converges with our most profound and universal human need, the necessity of rest. We have followed them through the chemical rush and the psychological crash, witnessing their desperate fight against the body's natural demands. Their final quiet acceptance of vulnerability is the thread that leads us now into the present moment of stillness. The central psychological theme of their struggle was the pursuit of meaning through performance. They believed that to stop was to fail. We carry this same quiet stress in our modern lives, the anxiety that tells us we must be constantly productive, always vigilant, always awake. Allow the profound tragedy of the war veterans' chemical exhaustion to remind you that your worth is not measured by your wakefulness, but by your capacity for gentle, restorative rest. Picture yourself now in a place of perfect safety and comfort. Feel the soft, deep quiet surrounding you. Let go of the need to solve, to plan, or to analyze. Just like the soldier who finally put down his weapon, allow your mind to put down the heavy burden of the day. The work is done. The vigilance is no longer required. You are safe and you are ready to surrender. The only endurance required of you now is the patience to be still. Notice the slow, gentle quality of your breath, a soft, unwavering rhythm that connects you to the deep, healing forces of nature. The peace you seek is not something external to be acquired, but an internal state to be rediscovered, a deep-seated clarity that was obscured by the day's noise and stress. As the final historical echoes of the drug-fueled war fade completely, remember this: the ultimate victory is found not in fighting one's own limits, but in honouring them. Let the courage of these veterans, who eventually chose peace over the pill, guide your own mind toward a natural, deep and untroubled rest. You have endured your day. Now, allow yourself the gift of night. As the final, distant echoes of that chemically fueled war fade into the silence, we let go of the soldiers' desperate search for endurance. Their ultimate lesson was that true strength and true peace cannot be sustained by unnatural means. The meaning they sought in hypervigilance was a shadow. The true meaning lies in the courage to surrender to rest. Allow your mind to accept this simple, necessary truth. Letting go of all the demands and expectations that follow you through the day. Like the weary pilot finally grounded, or the tank driver whose engine is silent, you now have the freedom to accept the deep, restorative power of stillness. Picture your mind as a vast dark sky, just after the sun has set. Notice the swirling thoughts that still move across it, the anxieties, the plans, the memories. Do not try to fight them or judge them. Simply observe them as slow-moving clouds in your vast, peaceful sky. Now let your attention drift down into your body, feeling the gentle, heavy weight of gravity holding you securely. The ground beneath you, the mattress supporting you. These are anchors of safety. Feel the weight of your eyelids, heavy and soft, and the slow, rhythmic rising and falling of your chest. This simple, quiet motion is your body finding its natural rhythm, reclaiming its own power from the stress of the world outside. Each breath in is a gentle intake of peace, and each breath out is a release of tension, a quiet surrender. Release the tension in your jaw, soften your forehead, and let your shoulders drop. There is nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to achieve in this moment. You have sought meaning through your own adversity today, and now is the time to find it in the quiet dignity of rest. The thematic thread that binds these historical figures together is the universal search for purpose. They found it in conflict. You find it in quiet acceptance. Let their journeys remind you of the profound human capacity for resilience, but also the beautiful necessity of vulnerability. Rest is not a failure of will. It is the ultimate act of self-care and necessary endurance. Drift deeper into this comfortable stillness now. As the historical whispers of that intense, chemical endurance fade completely, we return to the stillness of the present moment. Remember the simple lesson of those who fought the longest war. The truest meaning comes when we honour our own needs. Let the psychological journeys of these figures Their moments of high energy and their inevitable crash serve as a final calming reminder. Allow their stories to dissolve now, leaving only the tranquil sound of my voice and the sense of deep, comfortable weight in your body. There is only stillness left. May your sleep be deep, restorative, and entirely your own. Good night.